here.
Well, hello, I'm Debbie Kitterman, and welcome to Dare to Hear the podcast, where we equip you and challenge you to dare to hear the voice of God. Well, I'm really excited to introduce to you my next guest. It's Hubie Syn, and he wrote a brand new book, Lessons from a Wandering Prophet. But first, let me introduce you to him by reading his bio. Hubie Syn is a speaker and a prophet who travels around the world. He has ministered to National Football Championship hero David Tyree, media personalities, Grammy Award-winning artists, and countless others. He's a certified public accountant by trade, and he resides in New Jersey with his wife and his 5 children. Well, Hubie, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm a confession that I confessed to Hubie. I'm going to confess to my entire audience that I didn't actually know who you were. I knew of you, but not who you were when I read the your title of your book, and it was sent to me by your PR people. And I was like, oh, I really like this topic and Lessons from a Wandering Prophet. It's going to speak to all of our listeners from the podcast. And so then I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, Hubie is the one that did David Tyree, and he did, well, we'll talk about that in a minute if you've ever read the Harbinger and Jonathan Cahn. But this is the guy that gave those prophetic words to people. And his book is such a great, so many great things, Hubie, that you had in there. And I think the first one that I want to talk to you about is really, you did this in conversation of really sharing your life story, right? And talking to us. And this is your second book. And your first book really was your story leading up to meeting Jonathan Cahn in the airport and the Harbinger. So I just thought, tell us a little bit about your story. What got you to where you're at today and getting to write this book?
Okay, the first book, it was called Tales of a Wandering Prophet, and it basically details my wife and I, our lives going forward, and what God did to really change that, because we were both professional people doing very well financially, and then God stepped in. But you know, we were doing well financially, but we were miserable. Family life was a mess. Everything was a mess. Yeah. So we were praying for God for change, which we didn't really know what that would look like. And then he told me to quit my job, because at that time I was running a fashion company, and told my wife to quit her job and to have another child, which we had 4 already. So it was a whole life change events. Wow. So when all of that happened, it was kind of like life just threw us, and life became a tailspin. I mean, literally, you didn't know what was coming. You know, it was just a very rough time at the beginning. Like, did we make a big mistake and everything? And then God kind of stepped in and kind of started to show us a path to go. And during that time, I was meeting people, because I wasn't in an office all the time. So I was meeting people in public places. And not really knowing what I was doing, I just felt like a nudge to pray for somebody, and they would be highlighted to me. So I would just walk up and just say, oh, by the way, God wants to tell you something. And then I would just say it and then leave, because I didn't know really what I was doing. And before I did that, I would always look and see my escape route, because I said, if people think I'm crazy, then at least I know that I'm out of there. So I used to walk up, say it, and leave right away before the person could say anything. And then it got to the point where they wouldn't let me leave. They wanted to know who I was. And it all happened in public places. There were restaurants, gas stations, parking lots, all kinds of different places, but it was never church. So when God got a hold of that, then, I met, David Tyree, because I was supposed to be his accountant, which I became. And then I met Jonathan Cahn in an airport. And then there were countless others, but it was just kind of like every time that God would nudge me, it was in a public place. And I just kept tapping people, but the people I tapped were actually praying to God to ask questions, or they were at a major point in their life. So that's kind of how it started. And then it just kind of escalated from there, that, the more that it came towards me, the more I ran from it, because I didn't want people following me home. I didn't want anybody coming to my door, that type of thing. And then it just kind of just went from there. So it was literally God was kind of directing my path, and he still does, because I don't really do anything. I just kind of just do what he tells me to do, and then I just leave it at that.
As it should be. That's what Jesus told us to do. Do what the Father tells you to do, and say what the Father tells you to say. And we need more of that, and not adding to it. It's interesting because when I was first learning in the prophetic, I grew up in a church that didn't really talk about the prophetic. So it really wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I began to get mentors, and God picked us up and moved us to a new location. And I learned about it. But the prophetic people in my life were like, "Oh, you're a drive-by prophet." And I was like, "What?" And they're like, "You come in and you do your thing and then you get out of there." And because I, just like you just said, I was looking for my escape route. Okay, well, I'm going to get in. I'm going to obey God because I know I have to obey and I have to do this, but then I'm out of here as fast and quick as I can possibly be. Right.
Absolutely. Because if you're wrong, bye,
bye, I want to be out of here. Exactly. So that makes me feel so much better that you said that you were also looking for your escape route. So did you always know that you were prophetic or a prophet? Did you grow up knowing about?
We used to go to a prophetic church in Manhattan, and they had the prophet of the house, and I was in the kids' church because I taught the kids. Mm-hmm. And then we had a false prophecy which happened to us, which was about my wife was pregnant with our child. And they called us up to the front, and we got words about this child. The prophet said something else, and then a few weeks later, we lost the child. So I was devastated personally. Yeah. So it caused me to rethink my walk at that time. So not knowing what to do, because accountants were trained to think the worst case scenario. Yeah. So I was like, I don't know what this is, but all I know is it's wrong, because, there's no way you can really squeeze that into anything else. So we left church and we left God for a year. That we didn't do anything. We're going out for Sunday brunch, no more praying and all that, because I was just confused. I was very hurt. And then God, in his infinite wisdom, I'm not really a fan, or at least I used to not be a fan of televangelists. Mm-hmm. And that's what God used to kind of pull me back in, which is kind of funny. And then that kind of got my walk back going. And then I'm busy tapping people, praying for people, I thought. Mm-hmm. I had no clue that it was prophetic. When I found out it was prophetic, I got terrified because I was like, I'm not trained. I don't know. I don't want to mess up because of how I got hurt. I don't want to do that. Yeah. And then it became a whole big thing that it took my anxiety level from like a 2 to like a 10. Now I'm more scared because I don't want to mess up. If I mess up, then not only am I messing that person up, I'm messing up God, and I don't want to make him look bad. And all of these negative thoughts would always start going through my head. Mm-hmm. And then I said, well, anybody can be used. The Lord took me to Numbers, which I figured I'm an accountant. He's taking me to the book of Numbers. And then I read the story about the donkey talking. And I was like, okay, well, all right. So you're thinking me a little better than a donkey. Okay, so I'll do that. So then I kind of just said, okay, well, I'll keep doing what you want me to do, but I need to know it's you, because I'm terrified that it's words have a lasting effect on people. Yeah. So he in his infinite wisdom gets me sick. My stomach will start turning. I mean, literally like I ate something bad or I'm ready to throw up. Yeah. And then when I say, okay, I'm going to do it, because I gave him free will when I said, take care of my family and I'll do anything you want. I didn't really know what I was signing up for. So if I tell him, okay, I'm going to do it, which he knows I will, then all of a sudden I'm not sick anymore. Then I just go do what I do. And I think because I have that check now that I really know it's him, then I don't have any issues of tapping people. It's easier for me because I know. It's just the process to get there is not the most convenient.
I was going to say, and the not the most comfortable, because I was reading that part in your book. I was reading that and I was like, oh, I'm so glad I don't have that as my warning sign, because I'd be like, no. And so that was, but really you were trying to figure that out too, and you shared your journey of, why am I always getting sick, and asking people, and they're like, I don't know. That doesn't happen to me. And I always used to say to people, okay, so, we do prophetic ministry and we'd have a session of ministry, and they're like, Debbie, you haven't said anything. I'm like, yeah, because what I got is not like yours. And I was comparing myself, and you talked a little bit about how you were asking people, how do you know you're supposed to minister? And you're like, I get sick. And they're like, yeah, that's weird. And you really talked about the uniqueness of how God created us. I wasn't going to ask this question, but you talked about this a little bit about processing the church hurt with false prophecies, because I think that happens a lot. And I think a lot of the people that I've run into are in two camps, right? I wish they were in the middle camp, but they don't seem to be there. It's either they've been hurt by prophecy, they don't want to have anything to do with prophecy, so they push you away and there's a wall up, or they're so chasing after it that it's all they want. And I like to call them the fruits and the nuts. And then there doesn't seem to be really any middle ground where people really do the testing and holding it before the Lord and doing their part. But when, and those that have been hurt by it, it's because of these false prophecies. What wisdom, counsel, advice would you give to people of walking your own journey of having false prophecies given to you and really, holding on to them and then seeing them come out? How would you help somebody process moving beyond that? You talk a little bit about that in your book, but also I think there's
in the first book, there's like a whole chapter on it.
Okay. And I haven't read the first book. So all in fairness to you, I haven't read the first book. So I'm just making that confession too. So
that's okay. The first book, my wife and I, when we were writing it, we were like, should we really put it in there? Yeah. And then I said, we're going to put, I'd like to put the ups and the downs because nobody has all the ups all the time. Yeah. So that chapter was the one that everybody wanted to speak about. Everybody. So you picked up on that. So what we did was I stayed out of church, my wife and I, for a year because I was severely hurt. Yeah. I took it more worse than she did. Yeah. And then when God started to call us back, we used to go to a church that our friend used to attend, this prophetic church we went to, and they had all these guest speakers come in. And when the guest speakers came in, they would all point to people and I'm like, stay away from me, Mm-hmm. They could pick out my wife, but I wasn't ready for it. So over time, every now and then somebody would pick me. They would say you, and my guard is totally up. Yeah. And they would look at me and they would just like point to my chest and they would say, they give me this funny smile, like this, and then they'd say there's greatness in you, and I'd be like, okay, and then that was it. I got that same prophecy for years. So after a while, you scratch your head. You're like, well, what do they mean? So you get basic. Jesus lives in my heart. He's great. And you so I didn't know really what was coming. But as time went on, God had me question more about the prophecy, learn more about all these false prophecies. Because when I get prophecies now, people are like, what do you think? I'm like, we'll see. Mm-hmm. When I see it start to happen, then I know it's kind of like a road sign. Yeah. But I got hurt a lot because what people told me, I acted upon it. I was making decisions, I was doing all of that, and then which really wasn't the right way to go. Yeah. So I just say, we'll see. I assume that the person who's coming to me has good intentions. Mm-hmm. And if they have good intentions, then I'll just say, okay, well, at least they're trying rather than not trying, because I've been in that position myself. But I'm not going to totally bank on it until I start to see the fruit of it. So that has helped me. And, I try to have sympathy for people and compassion, because if they are bold enough to come walk up to me and give me a word that they truly think it is from God, then I'll honor them, and at least they're trying, because a lot of people don't. Yeah. So that's the way I've managed to process through it, but it took time. Yeah. But now that I'm older, that's kind of how I process it.
Well, and I appreciated too in this book, and I'm assuming you did the same in the first book that you wrote, is you really just kind of, you told your story, but you told all of it. You didn't hold anything back. You were real, like, so I did this, and this is the question that I had, and this is how I felt. And then the Lord talked to me. And so there was a couple of things I want to talk about, because I think I've seen this in people a lot. And the first one is early on in the book, you talk about not all opportunities are from God, even though they may seem to be. So can you unpack that just a little bit? Because I think sometimes we're like, well, this opportunity is put in front of me. It must be God. This is what I've been praying for. And that it not necessarily is. So and that's going to lead me to my next question after you unpack that.
Okay. Well, I have learned that if I think, or let's say I got a prophetic word, let's just play this along with me. Okay. Okay. Let's say I got a prophetic word that I'm supposed to write a book. Okay. We'll just kind of use that. And just because the opportunity is like, oh, somebody wants me to write a book, I don't necessarily jump at it. I'm like, okay, well, this could be God, but then again, it may not be. Because, I believe that the enemy is always trying to derail us all the time. So I'm like, okay, well, let me just kind of walk down the path. And if it truly is God, number one, I take my time, because in business, I've learned that whenever I made rash decisions at the spur of the moment, they never really panned out. Oh, you got to do this today or else it's not available or what. I don't fall for any of that anymore, because if God has an opportunity for me, I can kind of take my time. So if I just take my time and just question it, test it, the opportunity will still be there, then I know that it's possibly that God is leading me down this path. I wait for peace. If I'm praying and I don't get an answer, to me, God is not giving me an answer.
Yeah.
So if he's not giving me an answer, I'm not doing anything, because God usually leads. So if he tells us this is of me, I'll go do it. But if I'm praying and I don't hear anything, I do nothing.
Okay.
Because to me, he's not giving me an answer, but he really is. Because if he's not giving me any kind of conversation back and forth, then it must not be him.
Yeah.
And it may look good, it may be window dressed perfectly, but if it's not God, then I don't want any part of it. Because God usually doesn't come give you an opportunity, let's say, that everything is rosy. It's always something that kind of builds up your character as you're going forward. And it's usually not the obvious choice. It's the choice that you're like, what are you talking about? Because he has to build that testimony in us. That way, when we do speak about it, then he draws people to us, because it didn't happen the way the world does, because he doesn't play by those rules.
That's true. That's a good word right there. Early on in the book, and this is a topic that the Lord has really had me hone in on for this year, particularly. I mean, it's always important, but it's the topic of discernment. And in fact, you talk in being divinely positioned in that chapter. You talk about learning to discern is a key, and it is essential that we be able to learn it, to know it, and figure out the difference and discernment. So can you kind of unpack the different types of discernment? Because you talked about a few different types of discernment, and why is it important for us to discern?
Okay, well, discerning is basically, at least to me, it's God basically warning me or giving me a signal that something may not be 100% correct. So in the old days, when I was younger in my walk, I was taught that if you get a check, meaning something feels uncomfortable, whatever, you stay away from it, because God is telling you. So I would do an abrupt face and I would just leave. I would totally just cut that person off or whatever it is. As I've kind of been in the field more, let's say traveling and stuff like that, I meet people that I will, quote, get a check, but unless it's really God telling me you need to stay away from them, I just keep my guard up, because I don't know really what God's plans are. It may be that I need to minister to them. It may be God's going to use that for something else. So rather than being abruptly faced and leaving, I would just kind of just walk along, but my guard will be up. And sometimes it's been like that the check is the opportunity that is presented to me, which I wrote in the book, but it actually, that got me to meet these people, but it was really because he wanted to tell them something. So I've learned that about discernment as far as opportunities that kind of show up.
Yeah. And I really like the way that you broke it out too. And really it was just like, it was being in tandem and listening to the Holy Spirit as you were walking it out. And he was giving you that discernment of yes, proceed, but cautiously, or no, don't go. And I really appreciated, because I think sometimes when somebody gives us prophetic words, or we get prophetic words for other people, we don't allow the discernment piece to come in. And I think one of the things when I do minister to people, and I appreciated that about you too, and what you said earlier about processing the hurt, is we really have to take time and say, well, let's see, like take it before the Lord. I always tell people, like, they'll look at me like, that's really crazy. I'm like, I just no. I even had some missionary friends just before they went to go on the mission field, and I gave them this word. I'm like, I don't even know what this means. Like, I just had to describe this picture to them, and they're like, and they said to me a couple years later, like 3 or 4 years later, and I would go and serve with them on the mission field twice a year when they were stationed in the Dominican Republic. And I remember them saying, we just found that prophecy that we had recorded, and we put it on our computer, and we we thought you were crazy. We thought you were so off the mark. I'm like, so did I. And they're like, but it makes sense now. And I'm like, whew. And I had to get over that in myself. Like, it's
absolutely. Because it makes you feel so small. Yeah. And you're like, did I mess up? Oh, what is this going on? And then it's a whole big thing. I mean, I learned that early on because when I got married, because I came from 4 children, there were 4 siblings. My wife and I, when we got married, she goes, I'll give you 1 child, maybe 2. And that was it. And then there was this Jamaican woman that the guy's like, oh, she's a prophetess. She came to my office and I was like, yeah. So he goes, she's from Jamaica. I was like, okay. So she's dressed out in this Jamaican garb and she's smiling at me and she goes, how many kids do you have? And I went, 2. And she starts smiling and giggling. And I go, why? I go, am I going to have more? Because I was just kidding around. She goes, you're going to have more. You're going to have 5. I started laughing. Tears were coming out of my eyes. I said, look, you're from Jamaica. You must be smoking something. I totally just kind of messed with her. And now we have 5 kids. So, yeah. Janet, if I ever see you again, I am so sorry because you knew and I didn't. Because a lot of times God will give us something that we don't understand. But as you said, later on, it came to pass. And then you're like, oh. So yeah. I can totally relate. Now I just say, we'll see. And then I just leave it like that.
And sometimes that really is what needs to happen. And, if we're giving words to people, we have to give them the space to receive, to wait, to see. And we just have to, I've learned this. I have to be obedient to what God has said to me. And that's my part. You even talked about that in here I use that line all the time. I'm just the mailman. I deliver the message. And then I don't come back to check on you to make sure if you did something with the message. That's between you and God. And so I really appreciated that too, because I was like, yay, I've learned that lesson. So, you had this chapter on facing our issues. And I was like, this is so good. And Hubie, the way that you presented this entire chapter and actually all of the chapters was so easy and palatable. Like that, I think even people that have hurt, that may think they don't have hurt or that are like, oh, I don't have an issue with that. We all have issues. We all have issues, right? And the Lord is wanting to deal with us. And you talk a lot about how if we don't deal with it, then the Lord can't really use us to the best of our abilities. But I loved this, you talked about your identity and your self-worth. And you said your identity is who you feel you are. Your self-worth is how much you feel you matter. And then you talk about distinguishing between your gifts and your identity and how you reconcile and departmentalize those things. Why is it important that we identify the difference between our gifts and our identity and that we move them apart? I mean, I know because I've watched too many people, but I want you to talk about that.
Okay, well, getting very basic at the beginning.
Yeah.
Our God, he is very creative. Right. Like in Genesis, when the world was null and void, it was dark. The Holy Spirit was hovering over the land.
Yeah.
Then he started to create. So he first was looking at a blank canvas. That's the way I interpret it. Mm-hmm. And then he got a thought. Then he's like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to make it. Now, scripture makes it very clear that he knew us before we were born. Very clear. Okay. Knew you before you were in your mother's womb, or the whole thing. So God thought about all of us before he made us. So however we got here and however we came out, this is who he created. You're different than I, but it doesn't mean that we can't be great, that type of thing. And even the gifts, they're not all the same. So when God creates us like that, our self-worth is basically God created us that way. Now, in order to please him, we try to use the gifts that he gave us to move forward to do his will. That's what we try to do. So when you make that, because we come from a society that, we have to earn our way. You got to earn your salary. Mm-hmm. You got to earn your living. You got to earn your way up. You got to study the whole thing. We are into doing things. And for God, it's kind of like he loves us just the way we are. That just enhances it because we want to be obedient to him. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily on how many prophecies we give, not necessarily how monumental they are or whatever it is, but just when he calls upon us to use it, then we're supposed to use it. We're not supposed to use the gifts to make us feel good, to give us value, to make it that way people will look at us a different way or whatever it is, because our identity is really in him, and he made it that way at the beginning. So, if you can accept the fact that, again, we all haven't arrived. Okay, God didn't make any of us perfect in his eyes, but he gave us things to work through. So if you could just be happy with who you really are, accept the challenges of some of your misgiving or of things that you don't do well in your mind, and then you're just trying to just do the best that you can, following God and using the gifts that he's equipped you with, then all of these self-identity issues are gone. Like, people call me a prophet. I don't really look at myself that way. I look at myself, I'm getting through life just like you are, just like anybody else. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really like that name because there was just so much stuff that came with it. Like, a lot of people will come up to me and they'll say, hey, you're a prophet. Can you give me a word? And there's a high expectation there. And the hardest thing was to say, I'm sorry, I don't have anything. Yeah. And they go, but you're a prophet. And I'm like, well, you're saying that I'm not, which doesn't make you feel well. It makes you feel very insecure. It makes your net worth go down to zero. And they're like, but how can you not have one for me? And then it just gets into all this other stuff. And I've just learned to just say, if I don't have anything, I'm not going to give you anything, because you could be hurt and it puts me out of line. So I'm sorry, that's between you and God. It's not anything to do with me. I'm a messenger. If I don't have a message, I don't have anything to give you. And that was a very hard lesson to learn. And it took a long time for me to kind of get through that, coming from the way that I grew up in my household, so that everything was striving, be the best you can and all this other stuff. So I was conditioned that way since I was a child. And then to just learn to accept myself as I was, and that just enhances it. That was a very eye-opening thing to learn, and very difficult at the time.
It is. And I think too, it's hard. It's not just in the prophetic. I think it's within all of us that we're looking for our identity and our self-worth in what we do. Mm-hmm. Years ago, I took this thing called Focus Living. It was a Focus Living seminar, and where you looked over your life but the thing that I took away from it was, it doesn't matter what I do for the Lord. It's just that I am. And I was like, ooh, I'm not very good at just being. I'm not a beer. I just don't sit still and here I am, God. I'm like, what can I do for you? And that I was finding that my identity and my self-worth was really tied to what I did for the Lord. And I've watched in prophetic ministry with other people that I've ministered with, that if they're not doing prophetic ministry, their identity and their self-worth is tied to that. And I had to come to the point where the Lord said, if you never did this again, how would you feel? And I was like, ooh, yeah. Okay. I got to work on that. I got to work on that. That
is a very hard question to answer.
Yeah. And it was, and it took a while. And I mean, even when we stepped down from pastoring, it was like, if I never get in front of people and I never share another prophetic word or preach a sermon, am I okay with that? When he told us to step down and to move. And I was like, yeah, because it's not what I do. I finally was like, I've graduated. Good. It's not my identity and my self-worth. But it's so funny because there's so many things that I related to in your book and that I relate to you too, because people will say, I had one person at a conference, it was a writing conference, not even a prophetic conference, say, I know what you do. I'm thinking, what do I do? I'm thinking, oh, I'm a woman pastor, because, that's kind of an anomaly in some places. Right. So I was like, what, that I'm a woman pastor? Is that a problem? Because some places are like, oh, you mean you're a pastor's wife? Well, I am that too, but I actually have my pastoral license. And she's like, no, you give words to people. I'm like, what? She goes, you're a prophet. I'm like, oh, I don't call myself that. And she's like, yeah, give me a word. I'm like, I don't have a word for you. I'm not a slot machine. You can't put in your quarter and pull the slot machine and out comes the word. And I had never said that. Hubie, I had never said that to anybody before. I had thought it just popped out my mouth. And then she was like, oh, okay. And then I was like, oh, I was so mad. And then the Lord's like, I do have a word for her. And it was so good and it was so powerful. But I was like, that was the first time I had ever vocalized, I don't have a word for you. You can't just get a word on demand. But I think that that's how people have treated prophecy. and treated
on
words.
demand.
Mm-hmm.
And literally you were being used for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
So that also adds to it too. So yes,
it really does. Well, and I like too, just, the people that you had ministered to and really how the Lord opened things up with Jonathan Cahn. Like it was before his book, The Harbinger, even came out, and you met him in an airport. Like God is a God of, I'm going to create circumstances and situations to get you in the right place at the right time. And then we have to step out in obedience to do those things. And so I really enjoyed that part of your story. And I was wondering too, how with David Tyree, how did you even come about like meeting him? But you said you were supposed to be as an accountant and you gave him this word, which, I'd heard the stories of him, and I don't follow football. So I was like, oh, but I've heard that story. So that was, I'm making all these confessions today, Hubie.
That's all right. We're friends. So
yeah,
it's all good.
We're good. We're good with that. Well, I wanted to talk to you because I think the part that resonated the most with me is really when the gift goes dormant. So I want to talk about that. But before I get there, I want to say, what are your favorite topics that the Lord had you write about in this book? Because there's so many that you discuss, but what are the ones that are your favorites?
I think my favorite one was with my son.
That was
and
good.
Also our friend named George, because, you don't really, until you walk through something, you have to walk through the hurt. Mm-hmm. And until you actually go and actually write about it and dwell upon it, that's when it becomes a much bigger thing than you kind of thought.
Yeah.
So, my son and I, and also my son and my wife, and even the whole household, it didn't get along for a long time. He considered himself the black sheep of the family. He was very different. We would go on family vacation. It was like, when is the explosion going to happen? Not if, when. And then there would be all the anxiety and the buildup up until when it's finally going to happen type of thing. Because everybody knew it was coming. It's just nobody knew what was going to puncture the balloon until it went off type of thing. And he wasn't really happy. He wasn't satisfied. And no matter what you did. So I used to say, well, we have 5 kids, 4 are doing fine. What else can I do type of thing? Yeah. So, when my wife came and said, my son was living in California, barely making a living. He was living off of eggs and protein powder and working in various jobs. And she goes, we need to pray our baby home. And I paused and I went, oh, it wasn't like, yes, let's bring him home. I love my son. It was kind of like, okay, let me see. He comes back home. There's probably going to be fighting. There's probably going to be disagreements. There's going to be the explosions once a month, like it was when he was growing up. And I wasn't too keen on the idea. And then my wife basically got mad. She was like, we need to bring him home now type of thing. So when he came home, the whole thing happened just like I knew it was. And I was like, why am I going through this? This isn't going to work and stuff like that. And then over time, God stepped in mercifully and, he mended everything to the point now where my son is like my best friend. Mm-hmm. We hang out all the time. We understand each other. He understands what he put us through. He understands why I did certain things. I've apologized to him. He's apologized to me. And now we have a great relationship. But it took 25 years to get to that point. So that's kind of like a redeeming thing. Like, okay, Lord, I'll follow you because look, you mended that relationship that I never thought was possible.
Yeah, that was a beautiful story. That and then also about your friend George too in the book. And I really loved seeing that piece because as a parent, that was prophetic, but for my early years, didn't really know I was prophetic because I wasn't in a church that really talked about it. But then I utilized my gifts in the wrong way with my children, which caused stuff. And I have had to apologize. We have great relationships now. And now, they call, I have just 2, son and daughter, but I was like, yeah, I totally used what I knew in the spirit in the wrong way instead of having a relationship. And so it's great when the Lord can redeem and restore those things. And I really love that story about your son. The one of the final chapters in the book not the final chapter, but you talked about when the gift goes dormant. And this just so resonated with me. And I think it's because, COVID kind of made us do a lot of reassessing and we were withdrawn. And you talk a lot about too, I call it submitted, committed, and connected. You call it different things, but you talked about the importance of being connected with other people and being in community with other people. But when you got to this part about the gift going dormant, I found in this season, with us suddenly being told to move clear across the country. And we've watched other people get picked up and moved to different locations as well. And it was never in their mind. And then they're kind of at this loss of, well, I have this gift. Now, what am I supposed to do with it? And it's still there, but it's dormant. So talk to me a little bit about this chapter, because it was such a good chapter.
Well, what kind of spurred that was my son had a friend visit us. Okay. And my son was in California because he went to the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry with us.
Yeah.
And so he came to visit us and we were having a chat and we were both talking about, because now he's in Texas, him and his wife. And he's like, I have this gift. I'm not using it. And I was like, well, I kind of discussed it with him that, you're valuable with or without it. That's just something that enhances it. He goes, yeah, but I'm not using it. I'm trained and I'm not using it. So that kind of piqued my interest. So we just had a nice long conversation about that. And then I got a call to go to my friend, Pastor Walter's church. And I hadn't been ministering or anything to anybody and just been home because everything was shut down. So on the way, I'm pretty pliable. So I don't really think much about it. So I'm like, well, it's God. He's going to work through me and stuff like that. So I'm driving along. It's about a 2-hour drive. I'm in the car. All of a sudden, this anxiety came over me. And during that, it became, what if you're not up to speed anymore? What if the gift isn't there? What if, you mess up? You're out of practice? And all of these questions really started to kind of mess with me mentally. So I'm driving and I'm sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, yeah, should I have prepared? Should I? Because I usually just show up. So it's kind of like, oh, what's going to happen? And then I get there and my friend, I'm in his office before I go into the meeting. And he's like, so what you been up to? I said, well, I've just been an accountant, been at home. He goes, so you haven't really been ministering? I go, no. And he goes, you've been prophesying? I go, no. So he goes, this is going to be really good, Hubie. And he's laughing. And that just added to it. It's kind of like the worst fear that's kind of creeping up. All of a sudden that happens. So I walk into the room and there must have been about 40 or 50 people. Now they all wanted one-on-one. Yeah. And I'm just sitting there like, okay, I'm getting nervous. I'm like, Lord, I'm not getting sick yet. What is going on here? So I was just like, how's everybody doing stalling? And then eventually it happened, but it was kind of like, it was pretty scary. Yeah. So, but once I started, it was just as sharp as it was. As a matter of fact, it had actually enhanced. The prophecies were longer. They were more detailed. Like the prophecies when I first started, because we all do exercises, right? Yes. So when I first started, it would just be forward. Whatever God wants to tell you, it's coming type of thing. Yeah. And as time went on, it became, this is where you are, and this is where you're going. Now it's, when you were younger, this happened, this happened, this happened, this is where you are now, and this is kind of where you're going, which Jonathan Cahn actually pinpoint. You do from the beginning, the middle, and now where you're going type of thing. So that's how detailed the prophecies that come through me have become as my growth has happened. When I went to this church, I was there a long time because they were just longer. Normally, they're just a few minutes. Yeah, they're a lot longer now. The nights get a lot longer now because it just seems that they're more detailed, and I guess there's more things about them in there. So the time off actually, in a strange way, enhanced my gift even more than actually doing something. So, which I think that's because of during the pandemic, I was spending more time talking to God. I was reading more scripture. I was wanting to know more about him, that type of thing. So I think because I spent more time with him, that is kind of what came out. That's
really good. And you also put at the end of this chapter, you put like there's when things go wrong. You talk about that when things go dormant. And I'm just going to quote you on this because this was profound. And you said, authentic prophetic ministry is always initiated and led by the Holy Spirit. We understand that. But then and then you said a whole bunch of stuff that I highlighted. And then you ended that paragraph with this: obedience involves sacrifice and at times bearing the consequences of persecution and suffering. And I think that is so true when it comes to prophetic ministry, that we step out in obedience and that sometimes there is that persecution and that suffering that comes with it. And that then you say prophetic ministry is all about being available and pliable. And some of the questions, Hubie, that you asked, I was like, oh, I hadn't thought to ask that question. And others like, oh, I asked that question. Like, like in this chapter, my gift is not being used. Does that mean something's wrong? I was like, that was a good question. Is something wrong with me? Did I do something wrong? Because isn't that always our thing of, oh, we did something wrong? And it's not necessarily that.
Right. Well, we always look for, well, as a CPA, I think negatively. So I always interpret things negatively, and it's very hard to sometimes get through that. And even now it's, I still kind of do that. That's kind of the way I'm wired. My brain thinks through all the possibilities of everything. And so I ask the what if questions, and I'm a great problem solver, but sometimes I can get myself into too much by going down those roads. Okay. So your type of prophecy. So you've shared with us that you kind of get a little sick to your stomach before you start doing it. And I hadn't heard this word before, the way that people told you were an ecstatic prophet. And so is that like it bubbles up, or can you explain how that happens? Well, when I was comparing myself to other people,
yes,
because that's what we
don't do that, people.
Right. Don't do it, because that made me feel even worse. Because when you ask everybody, oh, I see things, I hear things, and then, oh, well, I don't get any of that. And they're like, oh, and then you start to say, well, something's really wrong with me. So is this really of God? So there were all these things that kind of really messed with me, because I was asking a lot of questions with no answers. So an ecstatic prophet, I met a guy in Australia, and he basically said, it's because you have these bodily functions, which I didn't know what it was. I mean, my first clue came because I met a man named John Paul Jackson, and, gave him a word. He said, wow, it really stunned him. He asked me about my gift, and then we're on the air. We're doing table talk with Joni. And, he started talking about my gift works. He opens his Bible, and he goes, the Spirit came over Mary and the Spirit came over David. And he goes, that's what you have. And I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. How can you even fathom that? I mean, me, if you knew my history, it'd be like, no, sorry, that's just like way, way above there. So then I met Jonathan Cahn. He asked me to go to his church because he really only listened to two people at that time. There was a guy who was in Brazil, South America, that was coming up, and he was out, after he ministered, he was out giving words. He came over to me and he said, well, when the Spirit of the Lord comes over you, this happens and this happens. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, they both said it. So I just discounted it. Didn't think much of it. Then when I went and met David was explaining to me that I'm really rare. And I'm like, okay, well, the type of thing. I just made a joke of it because I try to make a joke whenever I'm uneasy. So I was like, yeah, my last name is Syn. There's not many people like that. So he goes, well, Ezekiel, his blood boiled, Jeremiah cried, you get sick. He goes, it happens every time. I go, every time. I go, that's my check every time. He goes, so you have bodily functions. So he said that's labeled as an ecstatic prophet. He goes, I never thought I'd ever see one in person because it's rare. I mean, I've only read about it in scripture, and here you show up. And so he was asking me, he was picking my brain about how it happened, when it started and stuff like that. So he asked, does it ever happen? Does it ever not happen? And I said, well, it happens all the time, because I may probably at this stage, I could probably just go and give a word. But until I get sick, I won't do it. And it drives my wife crazy. But I was like, until I actually go through that process, I won't shortcut it. So
yeah. You want to make sure that you're really being moved by the Lord and by the Holy Spirit, and not necessarily because you can step out and you can minister. And I appreciate that. I had never heard that so I was reading that section, and I was like, oh, it's so funny, because I wouldn't have known probably who John Paul Jackson was either, because he just said John Paul. And I mean, I don't follow, we talked about this a little earlier. Like I don't follow a bunch of prophetic people. There's a few that I've read their books or I really appreciate them, but by the most part, I don't like follow and listen to them all the time. And so I was like, oh, I'm so glad Hubie and I are a lot alike in this area because I probably wouldn't have known who he was either.
but it does feel uneasy when people are like, do you know who that is? And I'm like, no. I said, he looks kind of like Kenny Rogers, I didn't know. But I think if I knew, that would probably make it worse. Because then I'd be like, really, should I go up and talk to this person? Because I didn't know, I guess it kind of made it easier because I didn't know anything about the person.
Yeah. So. And that's true. And I think, I did a lot of confessing to Hubie. I don't know. He's got this thing. He's just really comfortable. And I got a great new friend here,
by the way. So,
but I did, like I said, I didn't really know who you were. And so, because I would have, and I think the Lord does that to me for a reason, right? He knows my insecurities and he knows that I'm willing to obey. But that when I saw your topic, I was like, this will be perfect for the podcast because, lessons from a wandering prophet, like people need to hear this. It's Dare to Hear the podcast for a reason. And so if I would have known that you were the guy that gave the prophecy to Jonathan Cahn and that you were the one that did the prophecy, I might not have stepped out. I would have went, I'm just me, Debbie, Dare to Hear podcast. Like, I'll let somebody else interview him. But I was just like, the topic and I'm like, I'm just going to do it. I have nothing to lose. It'll be a yes or it'll be a no, and it'll be great. And here we are. And so here we are. So thank you for saying yes.
Well, again, we all have worth in God, so we're all equal. That's just the way it is. Different callings. That's all.
That's right. Different callings, different pieces. I want to end with this question, and then I'll ask you how people can connect with you. But I think because this is Dare to Hear the podcast and we're equipping people and challenging them to hear the voice of God, what is the best way for someone to determine if they have a prophetic gifting and how can they start operating in it?
Well, first of all, anybody can prophesy. Mm-hmm. But I learned kind of by accident this little, I guess, trick, we'll call it. Or this little lesson, like I've taught it to my kids, I've taught it to other people. So what you do is you take out your phone and then you turn to a picture or you have your friend do it, let's say. So your friend gets a picture of a loved one that you don't know. Mm-hmm. And what you do is you kind of home in on the face and you just say, you pray and you say, well, Lord, just give me something about this person. So literally you're just going to look at the picture and whatever pops into your mind or whatever God reveals to you, however it does, you're just going to say it out loud and see if the other person agrees or doesn't agree. So that way it's non-threatening.
Yeah.
And it's almost 100% that somebody's always been able to say a trait about them, just something that's kind of going on with them or whatever. And it's done in the safety of, a classroom or whatever it is. So that usually helps people a lot and it helps them gain confidence because people that never even thought that they could ever do it, like walk up to a stranger or anything else, everybody can look at a picture because everybody looks at a cell phone. And I've done it in actually big sessions and everybody was like, wow, I didn't know I could really do that. So, that's one, I guess, lesson that I've learned is start off by that and watch how it goes. And you'll be surprised really of what you can do when you do that.
Yeah, you're totally speaking my language. I am the activation queen. I love them. It's at the end of every chapter of every book that I've read, but I have not done that one. So may I borrow that for some of my classes? I like that a lot. I'll give people where I'll have them pull items out of a bag and then they have to give prophecies based on the item to the people. And they're like, that's not going to work. I'm like, it's so God, just wait. And then I make them use the same item for everybody that they're ministering to that night. And they're like, it was different every time, but it was so right on. Yes, I know, because God's good that way. So I like that activation, Hubie. So thank you for that. Okay. Can you tell people how can they connect with you and how can they get a copy of Lessons from a Wandering Prophet?
Okay. Well, the book is available everywhere online. Bookstores don't carry a lot of inventory anymore, which I found out. Because I was looking forward to go and purchasing it again at Barnes & Noble like I did the first one, but that didn't happen. So you can go to Amazon, you can go to HubieSyn.com, which is connected to Charisma Media. to get it there. If you want to get a hold of me, my website is pursuehimministries.com. I read every email that comes in. I'm also on Facebook as Hubie Syn, or Instagram, CPA365. So those are all the ways that people can get a hold of me. I may not be able to get back to you because sometimes I get a lot of emails, but a lot of times I read every single one of them. Just to
okay,
make
that's awesome. That's awesome. I do read all mine too. So, I mean, I do have some people that help me, but I like to do, I'm a personal, relatable person. I like to do that. So again, that's Lessons from a Wandering Prophet. I'll have the links in the show notes too, to the websites and things that he mentioned so that you can connect with him. Hubie, as we end today's podcast episode, is there anything else that you feel prompted that you want to say or impart, or a prayer that you want to leave our viewers and our listeners with today?
I just want to encourage them that, God made us all unique and special in his eyes, not ours, his, and that we're all able to do what God wants us to do because he gave us all gifts. Again, we're all the same. We just have different callings. Yeah. Some of us may be prophets. Some of us may be prophetic people. Some of us may be worship leaders, however it is, but God made all of us for a purpose. And when you know that God made you for a purpose, sometimes it can get frustrating that you don't know the purpose. So if you really pray and you just wait on him, because patience is a big key, and at least the way I look at it, then God will always reveal, because then you're just being quiet and listening. Because if you're so busy running around, he can't talk to you. So if you're quiet and you're still, God will show you what he wants to do with you, and life will become so much more abundant and satisfying and gratifying than you ever thought possible. Even though some of the decisions may not be easy making, God does have a plan and a purpose for everybody.
That's good. Thank you for that. That is really good. And it is so true. We are all unique. We're not the same, and we're part of one body. So Lessons from a Wandering Prophet by Hubie Syn. I will have this in the show notes. And if you haven't read his other ones, Tales of a Wandering Prophet, which I haven't, I'm going to buy so I can read that, so I can get the rest of the story. Thank you, Hubie, for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great, and it's been great just to meet you. So
yes,
I look forward to chatting again soon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am looking forward to that as well. Well, thank you for listening to Dare to Hear the podcast, where we encourage you to dare to hear the voice of God. I'm Debbie Kitterman. If you've been blessed at all in any way, we would love for you to share this podcast, leave us comments and reviews if you can do that, but share this episode so we can get out the message that Hubie has in his new book, The Lessons from a Wandering Prophet. And we look forward to having you join us next week on another episode of Dare to Hear the podcast. Until then, God bless and goodbye.
I'm not in the thunder, I'm not in the rain, I'm not in the winds of the hurricane. Look to me, I'm drawing you near, I have called you, dare to hear. 'Cause there's peace in my presence, so do not fear. Oh, do not fear. I have called you. In the fall of